In my 6 years that I spent in Washington, D.C., I learned an interesting phrase, and that is, fish is a four-letter word. And we heard a bunch of that about that so far. Obviously, managing fisheries is a difficult task, made more so by the fact that the very items we're managing are cryptic, right? We can't drain the pond and count them, nor would we want to, actually. But I want to make a few points in the few minutes I have today, and that is, first of all, that resiliency to perturbation is programmed into the life histories of fishes. And there's a whole variety of lifestyles of fishes. Fishes are the most prolific and, frankly, the most successful vertebrate life form ever to inhabit the planet. There's about 60,000 or so species, although nobody knows the actual number because we haven't explored much of the ocean in terms of where species lie. And that's an order of magnitude higher than the next most successful group, which are birds. And then it goes downhill from there. So this resiliency in fishes takes many forms. There's a whole continuum of life histories of animals that reside in the ocean, from animals that are very long-lived and slow-growing, the so-called K-selected animals, where they certainly have encountered perturbations in their climatology and whatnot, and their life history strategy is to hang around long enough to reproduce when you've got good ocean conditions. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got these animals that take advantage of the upswings of environmental conditions and they're able to bloom quite quickly in favorable conditions. And so two sort of opposite ends of the spectrum are red snapper in the Gulf of Mexico, which can live to over 5 decades. It can reproduce many, many times during its life history if it's allowed to, as opposed to something like Pacific sardine, where they're trying to take advantage of upwelling conditions and do so quite quickly. The important part about management of these fisheries is, number one, to be in tune with the life history of animals, but also management can either amplify the resiliency of the fish populations to change, or actually can dampen it out. And by that I mean a lot of times what we have is long-lived animals that are declining due to a variety of factors, and in particular when the climate is poor. The so-called ratchet effect wants to keep landings pretty much constant, and so you see these rapidly increasing fishing mortality rates that drive the populations down to these levels. The third point I wanted to make is recent trends document, particularly in the developed world, of great successes in terms of improving the resiliency of fish stocks and wresting sustainability out of what was, in many cases, a very non-sustainable situation. And as has been said, in the United States, the Magnuson-Stevens Act has been responsible for much of this at the federal level. The fourth point I want to make is fish consumption in the United States is heavily dependent on imports from foreign countries, and many of those countries have a very poor track record in terms of building sustainability and resiliency to their populations. And so if 90% of the things that we're consuming in the United States for seafood products come from places that have this poor track record, what is the environmental footprint of our policy? And how should our policies be oriented to this? And the last point is regulatory and increasingly market factors like third-party certification of fisheries can be powerful tools in terms of harnessing the notion of sustainability and resilience in the population. So I wanted to put this resilience in context. Both senators, I think, talked eloquently about the dependence of their states and communities on fisheries. If one looks at annual seafood production, it's about 160 million tons per year. It's a global figure. But if you actually look at wild fish consumption, it's around 67 million tons, or sorry, it's about 90 million tons, but it's actually quite static. And all the growth of fisheries globally is in aquaculture as opposed to wild fisheries. About 20% of the world's human population is dependent on fisheries-related products for their major source of protein. And in many cases, these are in the developing world, which in many cases are protein deserts. And so you've got this export machine to Europe, Japan, China, and the United States that's actually taken a protein out of locations that have a dearth of protein to start with. And in many cases, those exports, they tend to favor the elites in those countries, and not the income being distributed widely. And so point here is there's a major social justice issue related to our fisheries policy, which is primarily dependent on export. The total fish catch in the United States is about 9.5 billion pounds per year. It's been at that level for a long time. The United States is one of the top 5 fishing countries in the world, and as well the #1 importer of fisheries products. So that speaks to the demand for fish in the United States. And recreational fish catches is, I think in 2014, nearly 400 million fish. About 60% of that actually is returned to the ocean as either regulatory discards or ethical discards. People just want to go out and torture the fish a little bit and put it back. Sorry. In terms of, as I said, imported seafood is over $20 billion a year in the United States. And total fishery sales, if you actually look at not only the first sale value to fishermen, which is 5.4 billion, but you amplify that up in terms of the impact on jobs in the seafood industry at the retail level, it's something like $185 billion in seafood sales, and there's 2 million people involved. So resiliency in fisheries to the United States is a big deal. So this is my point about global fish production. The blue background graphic shows the annual production. This is based on FAO work, and you can see since 1995 it's quite flat. And the inset graphic shows that currently about 40% of all seafood products, including freshwater seafood products, is coming now from agriculture. And so what's happened to the underlying stocks? This graphic is also compiled by FAO, and it shows that the proportion of stocks on the planet that are considered to be underfished, and that is their exploitation rates are low relative to a sustainability metric, is declining very rapidly. There are very few stocks in the world that are actually considered underfished at this point. Fishermen have done a really good job of ferreting out available opportunities both at the national and international levels. And conversely, what you see is a higher fraction of depleted stocks. Now, in the United States, and certainly with the 1996 amendments and the 2007 amendments, there's much more specificity in the definition of sustainability metrics. And so I like to use this metaphor for the 2 aspects of the sustainability metrics which are important. One is glass half full or greater. That is, what's the size of the stock. And then the other part of this is how big is the spigot. And that's basically the exploitation rate. And if you have a spigot that's too open relative to what you want to do, you drain out the water from the thing. And so in a real sense, fisheries management is about both the overfish status, and that is, can you have the glass half full or greater, and then the fishing mortality, which is, can you keep the spigot narrowed down enough to actually fill the glass. So you can actually make this quite scientific. So the glass half full is on the x-axis here, and that's the current stock biomass relative to what we would consider the biomass that would give long-term sustainable high levels of yield. And then the blue part of this is basically the size of the spigot relative to optimal harvest rates. And for most things in the United States and globally, anything more than about 20% per year, the spigot is too wide open. And so you can see that in this graphic, there are 3 places you don't want to be, right? Number one, you don't want to be in a place where the biomass the glass is half full or less, right? And then you don't want to be in a location where the spigot is wide open. So that leaves that lower right-hand quadrant, where all fishes should be managed sustainably. And certainly this is the policy in the United States. The United States has exported this policy to the extent it can to other places in the world, and a lot of people are actually using this model in terms of maximum sustainable yield as the basis for management. So what's the track record? So if you look at that quadrant plot, this was a paper by Boris Worm and Ray Holborn and others in 2009, and you can see there isn't a whole lot of stocks that are out there in that lower left quadrant where we want to be. And one thing we can say, however, is that in terms of this picture, the situation in the United States is much less bleak. And so if you look at 2 metrics, what was going on in terms of overfishing and overfished stocks in 2 periods separated by 10 years, you can see major improvements in the fraction of stocks where overfishing was occurring, that is, the spigot's too wide, and then a major improvement in the number of overfished stocks. And you can actually put this on a map, and I apologize for a lot of the details here, but You can see that there's two metrics here. There's the squares, which represent the stocks that are depleted, and you can see that there's a lot of depleted stocks in New England, as you've heard about. And then the sort of septagon are the ones where the spigot's too wide. And it's interesting because obviously there's only about 8% of the stocks in the United States where the spigot's too wide. But they actually occur in fisheries that aren't under the strict control of the United States, and that is the highly migratory stocks. So highly migratory stocks in the Atlantic and the Pacific are ones where, in many cases, the United States is only the tail of the dog, in terms of contributing to overfishing. And so in a very real sense, we've done a good job of ending overfishing for most of the stocks that are on that list. But the real agenda kind of switches a little bit to the international agreement. So I wanted to get back to this idea of resilience a little bit and show you that even though red snapper is considered to be a management success in terms of stock rebuilding and whatnot, the yellow bars represent the age distribution of red snapper in the Gulf that one of my graduate students put together. And the gray bars represent, if you had no fishing at all, what would the age composition, in an equilibrium sense, look like? And so what you see is a lot of, animals, several decades old, which are disproportionately contributing to the spawning population that just aren't there. And that's the underlying resilience of this population to perturbations. And so, the point with fisheries management policy is if we can let those age compositions fill out, number one, we can be more resilient to high frequency variability, that is year-to-year variation in the production of baby fish, but also more resilient to the trended types of climate drivers as well. And this is the point about, red snapper being a success. Here you see the catch per day fish, or catch per trip in black, and the dollars per pound of red snapper. You can see that following the implementation of individual catch shares in this fishery, it's been a roaring economic success in terms of the situation that existed before. So last point, a couple of points I want to make are the status of the United States relative to global fisheries. So this is a paper that was published in Nature a few years ago by Tony Pitcher and his colleagues at the University of British Columbia. So to raise out all of the fishing countries in the world from left to right, right? And so what this is the compliance with the UN Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries. And this is somewhat of a controversial paper in terms of the metric itself, but the point is not lost. The countries over on the right-hand side of this, left-hand side of this graph, are the major, fishing countries of the world that have implemented sustainable fishing practices. So the United States is in yellow here. The big five are Norway, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And so they come out pretty well on this graph. And then you've got a whole array of countries that go down to North Korea and a few others on the other end of the graph. And the interesting thing is if you look at those yellow stars, they represent who we're buying fish from. And you can see that there's some pretty poor actors on that list relative to where we are. And so, point made. Right? So the other point I want to make on internationalism in fisheries is the so-called illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. And as I think Senator Sullivan said, there was a major new piece of legislation to try to combat this. The interesting thing is the United States is required to produce a list, or no fisheries, every couple of years, I guess. And you can see that the list keeps growing as opposed to actually declining, which is problematic. And solving the IUU fishing is not only interdicting pirate ships at sea, but it's also doing the hard work of tracking down the manifests from all these ships and making sure that they can't make port in various places. So in summary, achieving sustainability metrics, that is ending overfishing or building stocks, isn't necessary, but in terms of resilience, an insufficient policy choice for improving the overall resiliency, particularly as climate change is going to reset the table in many of the fisheries again. The MSA, especially the 1996 and 2007 reauthorizations, have really been successful. As our fishery policy is measured by any other fishing country in the world. But there's significant unfinished business, as we heard this afternoon. Frankly, we have to be very resolute in monitoring our stocks and their overfishing status, because that can change quite quickly, particularly as stocks decline or increase. And then because of the dependency of the United States, Europe, Japan, China on fishery imports, we have an obligation, a moral obligation, I think, to do more in terms of not only implementing standards, from the people we buy from, but also providing assistance to those countries as well. Thank you.